The camera pans over the skyline of San Francisco, early morning lights spilling across glass towers and quiet streets. In the distance, a modest sedan pulls into the parking lot of Vanguard Motors, a sleek, silver building that screams money and ambition. Behind the wheel is Jamal Washington, 32, tall, broad-shouldered, with grease-stained hands that tell stories of hard work more than luxury. He steps out wearing a faded navy blue jacket with a stitched patch that reads, Technical Consultant. It's a fancy title for what most in the company secretly call him, the mechanic. Inside, the lobby buzzes with energy. Polished shoes, tailored suits, designer laptops. Jamal moves quietly through the crowd, clutching his worn-out notebook full of engine sketches. As he walks past a group of engineers chatting near the espresso bar, he catches snippets of laughter. He thinks he's a consultant? Come on, the guy used to fix carburetors in Charlotte. Yeah, I bet he still uses a wrench to talk to AI. He doesn't respond. He's heard it all before. At his workstation in the sub-level garage, far from the fancy offices upstairs, Jamal begins checking the diagnostics of the company's latest pride, the Aether Drive, a $2 million AI-powered propulsion system for autonomous vehicles. It's supposed to be revolutionary, but for the past 6 weeks, it's done nothing but fail. He glances at the timer on the screen. 14 minutes and 37 seconds. That's when it always happens. The system overheats, stutters, and dies every single time. Jamal sighs. Machines don't lie, he mutters. People do. Upstairs, the CEO, Victoria Sterling, watches through a glass window. In her early 40s, sharp-suited, with platinum blonde hair and a voice that could silence a room, she's the kind of leader who thrives on fear. To her, credentials are everything, and community college degrees are beneath her empire. Later that morning, she gathers her executive team for a meeting. Jamal is called up, though he rarely attends these. He wipes his hands, straightens his jacket, and steps into the glass conference room filled with Harvard, MIT, and Stanford graduates. Victoria doesn't waste time. We've lost 6 weeks and nearly $500,000 trying to fix this engine, and I'm out of patience. Her icy blue eyes land on Jamal. Mr. Washington, you've been assisting maintenance, correct? He nods cautiously. Yes, ma'am. I run technical diagnostics on the... Diagnostics? She interrupts, a smirk tugging her lips. That's generous. You're a mechanic. Let's not pretend otherwise. The room chuckles. Jamal's jaw tightens, but he keeps his voice steady. With respect, ma'am, the problem isn't mechanical. It's in the data sync between... Enough! Victoria's tone cuts through the air. You're not here to lecture engineers from MIT about AI. Stay in your lane. Silence. Jamal looks down at the floor. But as he leaves the room, his eyes catch the project monitor flashing another failure. 14 minutes and 37 seconds. A small, knowing smile forms on his lips. He doesn't have the title, he doesn't have the degree, but he knows machines. And this machine is talking to him.
It was a Friday afternoon, the kind that stretched too long, where tension hung heavier than the air inside the glass tower of Vanguard Motors. The lab was a mess of open laptops, humming servers, and engineers with bloodshot eyes. Weeks of failure had eroded patience to dust. Victoria Sterling stood at the center of the chaos like a general in designer heels. Her voice echoed off the walls, crisp and sharp. Another failure? 14 minutes, 37 seconds. Again? The engineers mumbled excuses. Calibration, crude alignment, data corruption. None of it mattered. The investors were flying in from Berlin next week, and the company's reputation was on the line. Then someone, a young intern, whispered, Maybe Jamal should take a look. The room froze. All eyes darted toward the corner where Jamal was quietly logging test results. Victoria turned slowly, her lips curling into a smirk. Oh, of course, the mechanic will fix what my best engineers couldn't. Maybe he'll sprinkle some motor oil on the AI, huh? A few chuckles broke the silence. Jamal looked up, meeting her gaze, unflinching. Sometimes it's the simple things people overlook, he said softly. Her smirk widened. Then let's make this interesting, shall we? She stepped closer, her heels clicking like punctuation marks on the concrete floor. You think you can fix what MIT and Stanford couldn't? Fine, I'll give you 2 hours. If you can make that engine run past 14 minutes, you get a promotion, and I'll personally apologize in front of everyone. The room went dead silent. Then she added, almost like a taunt, hell, I'll marry you if you pull it off. Laughter erupted. Phones came out, recording. Even some of the engineers who respected Jamal looked away in shame. Jamal didn't flinch. He just nodded once. Deal. The laughter died quickly. His calm unsettled them. Victoria tilted her head. And if you fail, then I'll walk out that door for good. You won't have to see my face again. The silence after that felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. That night, as the others left, Jamal stayed behind in the dim glow of the lab. The hum of the server racks filled the air. He pulled off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and stared at the engine. He whispered to himself, "You're not broken, you're misunderstood." His fingers traced the wiring, the control board, the coolant valves. Every piece built with precision, but no heart. It reminded him of his grandfather's garage back in Charlotte, where machines weren't just metal, they were alive. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice. Every system tells you what's wrong, son. You just gotta listen. He smiled faintly. I'm listening, Grandpa. Upstairs, through the glass windows, Victoria watched from her office, a glass of red wine in her hand, amusement flickering in her eyes. Let him try. It'll be his last night here anyway. Little did she know, this mechanic was about to rewrite the story of her empire.
The next morning, the entire building buzzed with anticipation. Word had spread like wildfire. The mechanics taking the CEO's challenge. People who barely spoke to Jamal before suddenly hovered near the lab, whispering, laughing, waiting to see him fail. It was entertainment, a corporate gladiator match. Victoria arrived fashionably late in a white power suit that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Her assistant carried a tablet, live streaming the test to the executive board. Let's get this over with, she said coldly. 2 hours, Mr. Washington. Your clock starts now. A timer appeared on the big screen. 02:00:00. Jamal stood before the humming engine, the Aether drive, surrounded by a crowd of skeptics. His palms were slick, but his eyes were calm. He didn't see wires or code. He saw rhythm, a pulse waiting to align. He turned to the engineers standing by. Can you pull up the data logs from yesterday's test? You're wasting time, one of them muttered. Just do it, he said firmly. They hesitated, then complied. Numbers filled the monitors, columns of voltage, temperature, and runtime data. Jamal scanned the screen, frowning. Why does the temperature spike at the same time the AI syncs to the control servo? A Harvard engineer scoffed. Because it's drawing more load during adaptive recalibration. We checked that. Jamal didn't respond. He crouched beside the base of the engine, removed a small access panel, and examined the converter module. Inside, something clicked in his mind. The specs, imported from Germany, used metric calibration. The AI software, however, was coded in imperial units. He muttered, "They're talking in two different languages." He scribbled quickly in his notebook, then looked up. "Does anyone here have a frequency dampener or a phase regulator?" Silence. Then someone in the back, a maintenance tech, stepped forward. "I got something close." They exchanged a knowing look. Two blue-collar minds in a sea of white collars. The minutes bled away. 1 hour gone. Sweat rolled down Jamal's temple as he adjusted the circuits, spliced wires, and recalibrated the control board by hand. He bypassed the AI's default synchronization cycle, creating a manual override. Upstairs, Victoria sipped her espresso and watched through the glass. He's tinkering. That's not engineering, that's desperation. But Jamal wasn't tinkering. He was listening. Every vibration, every flicker in the control panel spoke to him. He tightened one last bolt, wiped his hands, and turned to the room. "Run the test again." "You sure?" a voice asked. "Do it." The engine came alive with a low hum. Smooth, balanced, steady. The clock ticked. 02:00:00. 14 minutes passed. Everyone leaned forward. 15, 16, 17. The hum grew stronger. Not chaotic, but harmonious. Jamal exhaled, whispering, "That's it. Talk to me." At 00:46:09, the system's performance meter hit 96.8%. The AI log flashed green. The engine stabilized. The crowd murmured, disbelief first, then excitement. Victoria's assistant looked up at her. "Ma'am, it's holding." "Impossible," she said under her breath. But it wasn't. It was happening. Jamal straightened, hands trembling slightly as the timer crossed the 20-minute mark, the longest runtime in company history. He turned toward Victoria's reflection in the glass wall. "You said 2 hours. Looks like I'll have some time to spare." Gasps and laughter rippled through the room. Not mockery, but awe. At that moment, Jamal didn't just fix an engine. He cracked the foundation of a culture that thought men like him didn't belong. And upstairs, behind her perfect smile, Victoria Sterling felt something she hadn't in years. Fear.
The lab was quiet again. The crowd had gone home. Only the faint buzz of servers and the rhythmic hum of the Aether drive filled the air. It was midnight now, and Jamal was still there. He leaned against a workbench, rubbing his eyes. He'd won the first round, sure. The engine had passed the 14-minute mark, but he knew this wasn't over. Tomorrow's demonstration for the European investors would be make or break. For the company, for him, maybe for his whole career. He walked over to the window that overlooked the dark city. Down below, streetlights glowed over the freeway, lines of headlights stretching endlessly like arteries of America itself. He thought of his grandfather, Leroy Washington, a man who'd built his life under cars in the burning heat of Charlotte. "You can't quit just because someone calls you less, son. They don't know what it takes to keep the world moving, but we do." Jamal smiled faintly, the memory warming him. He opened his old leather notebook, the one he'd carried since college. Inside were sketches, equations, and quotes his grandfather had scribbled in shaky handwriting. "Machines don't break, people forget how to listen." He ran his fingers across the words like a prayer. The next morning, he was back before dawn. The building was empty except for the janitor and the smell of coffee. Jamal began testing the drive again, this time with every sensor active. He watched the waveform spikes, the data streaming in. Something still wasn't perfect. It's good, but it's not good enough. He pulled open the engine's side panel, staring at the synchronizer module he'd patched. It worked, but under stress, it started drifting again. The AI's frequency was too sharp, reacting milliseconds too fast for the mechanical components. The difference was microscopic, but deadly. He grabbed his phone and called someone. "Hey, Uncle Ray, you still got that old vibration damper from the Mustang rebuild?" "You're still up fixing engines at this hour? You're just like your granddaddy." "Yeah, I guess I am. Listen, I think that old damper could help me test a frequency buffer. Just need to borrow the concept." "Come get it. It's sitting right where you left it, under the toolbox with your name on it." An hour later, Jamal was back, holding the dusty part like it was a piece of family history. He studied it, a simple steel ring that used harmonic resonance to stabilize vibrations in high-speed engines. He looked back at the AI core glowing blue inside its casing. "You're not that different," he said quietly. "You just need harmony." He worked through the morning, recalibrating, adjusting the AI's output intervals, and building a digital version of his grandfather's damper. Each time the test ran smoother, each time the numbers climbed higher. By noon, sweat dripped down his temples, but his heart was steady. The engine ran cleaner than it ever had, humming like a heartbeat. He took a deep breath. "You're ready for tomorrow." Then he caught his reflection in the steel casing. Tired eyes, grease on his cheek, but something else too. Pride. He'd come from a family that worked with their hands. Now those same hands were building the future. Upstairs, Victoria stood in the hallway, arms folded. She had watched him for the last 30 minutes through the security feed. There was something about the way he moved, methodical, focused, unshaken. Her assistant whispered, "He might actually pull this off." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not if I can help it. Because if he succeeded, it wouldn't just prove he was right. It would prove she was wrong."
The morning of the demonstration arrived like a storm front. Gray skies, cold wind, and tension so thick it vibrated through the building's walls. By 8 a.m., the main lab of Vanguard Motors had been transformed into a stage. Spotlights hung from the ceiling, cameras pointed at the Aether Drive prototype, and a long glass table awaited the European investors. The hum of whispered conversations and clicking heels filled the room. Jamal arrived quietly, carrying his worn leather notebook and a small toolkit. He wore the same navy jacket as always, grease stains and all. Some people snickered when they saw it, but he didn't care. Across the room, Victoria Sterling looked immaculate as usual. White suit, flawless posture, diamond earrings that caught every light. She was every inch the queen of her domain. But inside, she was unraveling. Her eyes betrayed it, faint traces of sleepless nights and too much pride to admit fear. Her assistant leaned in, whispering, "They're expecting a live test, ma'am. If it fails again, we're done." "It won't fail," she said automatically, though she didn't believe it. Jamal set up his workstation near the engine. On one monitor, lines of AI code scrolled like a waterfall. On another, diagnostic readings pulsed in real time. He'd spent the entire night refining the harmonic stabilizer he'd built, a digital equivalent of the vibration damper his grandfather had once used on a Mustang. But there was still something missing. He reviewed the AI's code again and frowned. The input-output ratios didn't align. It wasn't just mechanical desync, it was linguistic. He stared at a line of text. Unit measure equal imperial. Then another. Hardware standard equals metric. The realization hit him like thunder. The software was sending commands measured in inches per second, while the physical system responded in millimeters per second. The result, a 2.54x frequency mismatch. Small on paper,
catastrophic in motion. "That's it," he whispered. "They've been talking in different languages all along." He grabbed his notebook and began sketching equations, fingers smudging the pages. He designed a translator layer, a lightweight harmonic converter that could interpret commands between the two systems in real time. No one had noticed it because they'd all been focused on high-level algorithms, assuming perfection in the fundamentals. He coded fast, heart pounding, fingers flying across the keyboard. He barely noticed the people gathering behind him. A German investor asked, "What is he doing?" Victoria folded her arms. "Wasting our time, most likely." But when Jamal pressed enter, the system chirped to life. He connected his converter, reinitialized the AI, and reset the calibration. "All right," he said quietly. "Talk to each other now." The room fell silent. The Aether drive began to hum, a low resonant tone, smoother than before. The blue light across its frame pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat syncing with something alive. 5 minutes passed, then 10. 14 minutes came and went. Jamal's eyes locked on the data. The temperature stayed steady. The resonance graph flattened. The vibration frequency matched perfectly. No spikes, no dropouts. Then the efficiency meter jumped. 97.3%. Gasps rippled through the room. One of the German investors, Klaus Müller, leaned forward, eyes wide. "Mein Gott, it's perfect!" Victoria blinked, trying to process what she was seeing. That's impossible." Jamal turned slowly to face her, voice calm and even. "Nothing's impossible when you stop underestimating people." Applause erupted, cameras flashed, the engine purred steadily behind him like a symphony in motion. Victoria stood frozen, the smile on her face hollow. Around her, the board members were shaking Jamal's hand, praising his work, calling it revolutionary. One investor said, "Mr. Washington, we'd like you to lead the next phase of this project, perhaps even our European division." Jamal hesitated for half a second, glancing at Victoria. Her eyes said everything she couldn't: defeat, pride, and the sting of realizing she'd been wrong. He simply nodded. "I'd be honored." That day, Jamal didn't just fix an engine. He translated what arrogance refused to understand. And the hum of the Aether drive became the sound of change.
3 days later, the world was watching. The Aether drive demonstration was being broadcast live from Vanguard Motors headquarters. Every major network carried the stream. Social media buzzed with anticipation. Headlines called it the future of clean propulsion, and for the first time, Jamal Washington's name appeared alongside it. But Victoria Sterling wasn't smiling. She stood before the mirror in the executive lounge, fixing the lapel of her white suit, the same one she wore 3 days ago. This time, the color looked less like confidence and more like denial. Behind her, her assistant whispered, "The press conference begins in 10, Miss Sterling. They're already chanting Jamal's name outside." Victoria closed her eyes, steadying herself. "He's a mechanic," she said quietly. "He's the mind behind the engine. That doesn't make him one of us." Camera pans across the packed hall, flashbulbs popping, journalists holding mics, the massive Aether drive gleaming under blue light. At the center stood Jamal, wearing a simple dark suit. No stage polish, no pretension, just calm focus. When he stepped to the podium, the crowd roared. "Good morning. My name is Jamal Washington. I'm not a CEO, not a scientist with fancy titles. I'm a mechanic who listens to engines, because they talk if you pay attention." Laughter, then applause.
For months, we've been chasing perfection through code, sensors, and simulations. But perfection isn't about control. It's about harmony. Machines aren't separate from us. They mirror us. When they fail, it's usually because we stopped listening. The word struck deep. Even the investors nodded. Camera flashes intensified. Comments flooded the live chat feed. This guy's real, not corporate. Finally, someone who understands innovation isn't arrogance. Victoria watched from the sidelines, every cheer a quiet humiliation. Then came the moment everyone waited for, the live activation. "System check complete," he said softly. "AI interface ready." He placed his hand on the terminal. A low hum filled the hall. The Aether Drive's blue glow brightened, spreading across the stage like sunrise over steel. The engine came alive, smooth, flawless, quiet enough to hear hearts beating in the silence that followed. Energy output, 99.8% efficiency. A reporter gasped. "It's breaking theoretical limits." Applause erupted, deafening. The investors stood cheering. Even the rival company's engineers in the audience were clapping. Camera cuts to Victoria, her face pale, eyes distant. The applause echoes like thunder around her. For the first time in her career, she wasn't the center of the room. She'd built an empire on control, on hierarchy, on being the smartest voice in every meeting. Now, all eyes were on a man who never fought for attention. He just did the work. After the event, reporters swarmed Jamal, microphones thrust in his face. "Mr. Washington, what's next? Do you plan to start your own company? Will you replace Victoria Sterling as CTO?" He smiled politely, shaking his head. "Titles don't matter. Results do. If Vanguard wants a future, it'll need everyone. Engineers, coders, cleaners, working like one machine, together." Victoria approached slowly, the cameras catching every step. The crowd went silent. She extended her hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Washington." He looked at her, not with triumph, not with spite, but something gentler. "It's not about winning, Miss Sterling. It's about finally hearing the same language." Their handshake lasted barely 2 seconds, but it sealed something larger than a deal. It was the quiet surrender of ego and the start of something human. Music fades in, soft piano, rising strings. Voiceover for a cinematic cut. When power meets humility, something shifts. The world doesn't just change because of innovation. It changes because someone dared to listen. That night, Jamal returned to the old workshop where he'd started. Just a small garage filled with tools and dreams. He placed the original Aether Drive prototype on the table, smiled, and whispered, "We did it, Grandpa." A faint hum filled the air. The light on the engine blinked once, steady, alive.
The following Monday, the mood inside Vanguard Motors was electric, at least on the surface. Headlines were still celebrating the mechanic who saved Silicon Valley. But behind closed doors, the boardroom felt like a storm waiting to break. Victoria Sterling sat at the long glass table, her jaw tight, posture perfect. Across from her, a row of board members whispered to one another, while the company's legal counsel flipped through documents. At the far end sat Chairman Everett Liu, a quiet man known for his precision. His gaze moved slowly from the reports to Victoria. "Miss Sterling," he said, his tone calm but cutting. "There's a question of accountability. You publicly humiliated one of our engineers, nearly cost us a multi-million-dollar deal, and undermined our diversity policy." Victoria swallowed hard. "With all due respect, Jamal wasn't an engineer at the time. he was maintenance staff. My comments were misinterpreted. Everett's eyebrow lifted. The live stream says otherwise. Silence. Only the faint hum of the air conditioner filled the space. Effective immediately, Everett continued. You'll be stepping down as CEO. You'll remain as strategic advisor during transition, at reduced compensation. Mr. Washington's leadership on the Aether project will continue under direct board supervision. The words hit her like cold rain. You're replacing me with him? She asked, her voice barely steady. No, we're replacing arrogance with integrity. Across the hall, Jamal sat in the engineering bay, surrounded by his small team. Many of them junior techs, janitors and interns who'd once felt invisible. He looked at them proudly. You know, he said with a grin, when I started here, they wouldn't even let me park near the front entrance. Now I've got my own key card to the research lab. The room laughed, the tension melting away. One of the interns, a young Latina coder named Sophia, leaned forward. Mr. Washington, does this mean you're the new CEO? Jamal chuckled. Nah, I'm just the guy who wants to make engines run smoother. And people too. He paused, eyes drifting to the workshop window. Outside, the media van still crowded the gates. The real fix, he said softly, isn't in the machines. It's in how we treat each other. That afternoon, HR called Jamal upstairs for a meeting with the board. Everett greeted him with a handshake, this time with genuine warmth. Jamal, the company owes you a debt. The investors are offering you a promotion, senior diagnostics engineer, with equity and your own team. You'll lead the Aether Europe expansion. Jamal hesitated. He thought of his grandfather's grease-stained hands, the long nights fixing engines in that tiny garage. He thought of every time someone called him the janitor or the help. Then he thought of Victoria, alone in her office, surrounded by awards and silence. I'll accept, on one condition. Name it, Everett replied. We start a mentorship program for underrepresented kids in tech. Real training, not PR fluff. I want this place to mean something. Everett smiled. Done. Meanwhile, Victoria sat in her corner office, packing her things into a small box. Photo frames, awards, the silver nameplate that once read CEO. As she lifted it, her reflection caught in the glass. Proud, exhausted, smaller somehow. There was a knock. Jamal stood at the door. She froze. Come to enjoy the view? She asked bitterly. No, I came to thank you. Her eyes narrowed. For what? The humiliation? For giving me the chance to prove myself, even if it wasn't meant that way. She stared at him, conflicted. You really believe this was fate? No, he said quietly. I believe it was a test, for both of us. He reached into his pocket and placed a small object on her desk. An old wrench, polished clean. My granddad gave me this, said a good mechanic doesn't fix machines, he fixes mistakes. I think we both had a few to fix. For the first time, Victoria's facade cracked. A tear escaped down her cheek. She nodded silently. Good luck, Jamal. You too, Miss Sterling. He turned to leave but paused at the door. And Victoria, if you ever need someone to look under the hood again, call me. A faint smile crossed her lips. Careful, she said softly. I might take you up for that. Music. Builds. Slow gospel chords mixed with piano. Voiceover, narration tone. Sometimes redemption doesn't come with applause. It comes in quiet rooms where pride meets truth, and two people learn to see each other as human again. That evening, Jamal drove home through the streets of San Jose, windows down, air warm against his face. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He wasn't the janitor. He wasn't the token.
He was the man who listened to engines, to people, and to what silence had been trying to say all along.
A year later, Vanguard Motors looked like a different company. The walls that once echoed with silent tension now hummed with collaboration. The old executive parking lot had been replaced by a community green space, Jamal's idea. "Let sunlight in," he'd said. "Machines and people both run better that way." Jamal walked through the new innovation wing, greeting engineers, interns, and maintenance staff by name. In the center of the floor stood the Aether X, a next-generation engine that would power the company's first affordable clean energy vehicles. It bore a small inscription near the housing unit, dedicated to those who fix what others overlook. Every visitor stopped to read it. Sophia, now a project lead, caught up with him. "The prototype's stable at 99.9%, sir," she said proudly. "Good. That last 0.1%, that's the part that keeps us humble." They laughed together as cameras flashed. The Aether X unveiling was streaming live across 3 continents. But Jamal's mind was elsewhere. Later that evening, after the celebration, he drove to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Oakland. There, in a small brick building, hung a sign freshly painted in white and blue. "The Washington Workshop, Youth Mechanics and AI Lab." Inside, a dozen teenagers, mostly from low-income families, huddled over engine parts and laptop screens. Jamal watched them for a moment, hands in his pockets. "All right, who can tell me the difference between torque and empathy?" The kids looked confused, then burst into laughter. "Both can move the world," he grinned. "One turns engines, the other turns people." He guided a student's hand on a wrench, steady and patient, just like his grandfather once did for him. The sound of the workshop faded into the evening air. Across town, in a quiet apartment overlooking the bay, Victoria Sterling sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through her tablet. A news headline read, "Vanguard Motors named one of America's most inclusive tech companies." Her eyes lingered on the photo below, Jamal, smiling, surrounded by students. She exhaled slowly. On her desk sat the wrench Jamal had given her. She'd kept it polished, placed beside a framed photo of her father, the man who taught her to value results over people. Tonight, she whispered something different. "He fixed more than engines, Dad." She turned off the screen, closed her eyes, and smiled faintly.